Hello everyone, it's Elizabeth from the Smart Stitcher. Another question I often get asked is what type of needle do you use to sew leather with? And there are different kinds. So I've created a few little videos that take you through the different kinds of needles I use and when you might use them. So please enjoy. When saddle stitching, the type of needle that I use is a saddler's harness needle. So this is quite a long needle, it has a ballpoint end and it will just go through the hole in the leather that is made by the sewing awl. So whenever you are doing any kind of saddle stitch, you are making the hole by piercing the leather with the tip of your stitching awl, and then your needle and thread will go through the hole that you have created. As the hole for stitching has been created with the awl, you will notice when you do saddle stitch that the threads, often you have two threads passing through the same hole, sometimes more when you are starting and finishing. What we don't want to do is to go splitting the thread with a needle that has a particular point. So a ball point is very useful here because it just helps to preserve the life of the thread. The next type of needle I use is one where holes have been punched in the leather using a hole punch, and then the thread that I'm using, in this case it's a very sort of flat braid or woven braid, will go through a tapestry needle which has a slightly sort of ballpoint sort of blunted tip, so that will enable me to go through the holes as I lace, and this will stop the tip of the needle from damaging the thread. Whenever you are punching holes to put your thread through, you have to make sure that the hole that you punch is large enough for the thread and the needle to pass easily through, so that you don't wear your thread out and cause it to break or snap. When I'm sewing softer leathers, I tend to like to use two sizes of between needles. The first one is a finer one, that's a number 10, and I use that for tacking and for holding the leather together. The second one is a number 7, which is slightly bigger, and this is the one that I use when I'm doing the bulk of construction, and these are just some examples here with some running stitches. The reason I quite like this one is because when you go through and you make your hole in the leather, it is just a very sort of clean round hole with no tears, so it makes quite a nice stitch, and you don't damage the leather on the way in or the way out either. The next needle I'd like to mention is the glover's needle. Now this is slightly different from the other sewing needles in that it has a very slight diamond shape tip and blade, and it also sort of this diamond shape continues to almost halfway down the length of the needle. And I tend to find that when I'm sewing with a glover's needle, yes, they're very sharp, they do go through the leather really nicely, but sometimes they can leave a slightly sort of raggedy hole in the leather when you're sewing. Now, the sharp tip can often mean that it's quite hard to go through and do, say, an over sewing technique or a stitch where you are going through the same hole twice, because you run the risk of catching the thread with the blade of this needle. It's one that whenever I talk to people about the types of stitching I do with leather, lots of people assume that I am using a glover's needle, but in fact I often find that I get better results using the other methods. So we've got where an awl that I might use for saddle stitch, the punch that I would use for lacing or braiding, and betweens that I might use on a softer leather for gloving leather. So glovers, again, a lot of this comes down to personal preference, and I would always recommend having a sample piece of leather for your project so that you then do a little test and you can work out which one you prefer for your project.